If you were to ask what I think separates me from most of the people who work in this profession, it's this. I think most of the people who work in so-called capital P politics are irredeemable, and we should be better off without them. If you were to ask them, they would say, yeah, we screwed up X or Y, but you don't know how to do Z without us. And everybody makes mistakes. In many ways, that's the central dividing line in American politics today. Do you acknowledge that things are bad and you want to tweak the system, or do you want to pretty much replace it? That's the framework through which we should approach the following subject, which has ignited a firestorm in our political discourse in recent days, after Brown University professor Emily Oster published a new piece in The Atlantic titled, quote, "Let's declare a pandemic amnesty," with the subhead, quote, "We need to forgive one another for what we did and then when we were in the dark about COVID." The crux of the argument is this, quote, "Treating pandemic choices as a scorecard on which people racked up more points than others is preventing us from moving forward." She continues, "We have to put these fights aside and declare a pandemic amnesty. We can leave out the willful purveyors of actual misinformation while forgiving the hard calls that people had no choice but to make with imperfect knowledge." Oster focuses much on the early days of the pandemic, like April and May, for which I actually do have some sympathy. So I think it's worth parsing out why people are so angry about this thesis. First is this. She is dishonest in her portrayal of, quote, hard calls that some had to make in early days. Nobody is mad at people for closing schools in March of 2020. Given the uncertainty, it was perfectly reasonable. What people are mad about is that schools were not reopened in August of 2020 after 6 months of data showed us that kids were not at risk. People are not mad that they were asked to mask up in the first couple of months of the virus. They are mad that many states and cities had straight up outdoor mask mandates for more than a year after the virus came to us and we knew with relative certainty that COVID did not widely spread outdoors. I'm not mad about lockdowns in the first 2 months of the pandemic, but I am furious that when a bunch of people take to the streets, that the public health establishment is willing to justify it completely and then have the gall to also say that it was okay for them, but if you want to walk your dog without a mask, then you're a grandma killer. Not mad about banning indoor dining in March of 2020. I am mad about heavily restricting it a year later, like we did here in Washington. People are not mad that a vaccine was created. I think people are rightfully mad that it was sold as a total preventative measure when it was not. When people were told it was 2, and then you're done. And then months later, we're still being forced to mask up, and then asked to get an additional 3 boosters. When thousands of people were fired from their job, fundamentally it was a false premise. What I'm laying out in this diatribe is that there were immense societal costs to wrong calls during COVID. On a scale, some people can be forgiven for lack of knowledge. But basically for me, everything past June of 2020 lockdown and mask policy-wise, and basically everything after the first 2 months of the mask rollout should not be. Or how about the lab leak theory? Should we really forgive and declare a pandemic amnesty to the people who unleashed this plague upon the world, covered it up, and are continuing to fund the very same research by the US government? Really? Should we really have an amnesty for Dr. Anthony Fauci, who is up there, in my opinion, with George W. Bush in terms of damage that he has wrought upon this country and its lasting legacy? He lied about the lab leak hypothesis. He admitted to lying about herd immunity. He manipulated the media throughout 2020 and 2021 to impact policy, which by definition curtailed the lives of hundreds of millions of our citizens. No, I don't think an amnesty is in order for many of these transgressions that I laid out. The reason why I think that the George W. Bush analogy is important is this. During the Trump years, you had 2 options. Either you thought Trump came out of nowhere and that half of America was irredeemably racist, or you took a second and you think pretty hard. How does America elect the dude from The Apprentice as president? If you are willing to ask that question, you had no choice but to grapple with elite failure at the highest level over 2 successive American presidencies where the, quote, experts were in charge. Trump was the cost of the war in Iraq, of the financial crisis, the turbocharging of cultural liberalism under Obama. To grapple with Trump, you had to accept on some level that the failures of the elite class, both then and going all the way back to the Reagan administration. That's why I cannot get behind a, quote, pandemic amnesty. I am wrong all the time, and I was very wrong about a lot of things during COVID. To the best I can, I have admitted to that to try and inform my perspective, because I think it's important to retain all of your trust. The elites in charge do not think that way. If they are wrong, they will never admit it because they are not accountable to any of us. They are accountable only to their flawed peers. That is how the people who got us into the war in Iraq are literally all multimillionaires with big careers in Washington and New York City, making big money while the kids that they sent abroad either died or came back missing a limb or missing the peace of mind that they once had. The point is that a quote amnesty only works one way. It forgives the crimes of the elite class, and it would do nothing for the people who lost their jobs. It would do nothing for the tens of thousands of drug addicts who died during the pandemic, for the millions who suffered depression or mental illness, took their lives, or just people who simply had a bad time and didn't have to. People in power should pay a price for that. Now, we can argue what that exact price should be, but an amnesty is not and should not be on the table. I believe this to my core about all elite failures. It's okay to be wrong. Anyone in power inevitably will be. It's not okay to be wrong, not admit it, reap consequences, and then say that the people who are mad should not be mad because they had the best of intentions when those people were wrong. Doing that over time is exactly how we got to where we are. Inevitably, it reveals fundamental discomfort on behalf of people who are professionally wrong with being held even somewhat to account. Now, do I have confidence anyone will pay a price? No. I don't. Republicans say they'll investigate Fauci. We'll see. I haven't had a real congressional accounting of elites since the Church Committee in the 1970s. And we live in a very, very different country today than we did then. Until then, we can come together with this. No amnesty for now. If you were to ask what I think separates